a few months ago when this channel was still in its infancy. I mean, it still is, but you know what I mean. One of the first alternate scenarios I crafted was one where Emperor Justinian, after suffering a traumatic head injury, abandoned Christianity entirely, returning instead to the classical values and pagan traditions of the old Greco-Roman gods. Now, since here, on this channel, we don't let good ideas go to waste, today we'll be recycling that same inciting incident, but with a completely different consequence. Because this time, instead of the accident simply altering his worldview, it gives him something far more powerful and broken, a supernatural gift that will allow him to see the future. And that's exactly the crazy alternate scenario of today. What if Justinian could see the future? Knowing this, how much of the future are we talking about? And will he only be able to see the future or also the past? Well, both, but with a lot of limitations. Let's just say that Justinian becomes able to access the entire history of Roman civilization, both its past and its future. From the legendary foundation of Rome in 753 BCE all the way to its final breath in 1453 CE, when the last flicker of Roman civilization finally died in the siege of Constantinople of that terrible day for Western history. But because for a video title for YouTube, it wouldn't have been very attractive to say something like, what if Justinian could see the past and the future of all Roman history, I chose a simple title that would still interest people to click on the video without being so long in the details of the real idea of this alternate scenario. So, for the sake of a cleaner thumbnail and more chances of this video to have success and reach, let's just keep calling it only, what if Justinian could see the future? After all of this said, let us begin our alternate scenario of today. The year would be 497 CE, the young Justinian, still not yet emperor, and actually, with his real name for now being Flavius Petrus Sabatius, was about to move to Constantinople under the care and patronage of his uncle, the soon-to-be emperor Justin I. But just a few weeks before moving to the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire that would change his life forever, fate intervenes to change it even more in this alternate timeline. Let's just assume his accident goes the same way as on my video where he rejected Christianity that you can watch after this one. And then after that terrible accident, the visions will begin. So, how his visions of seeing the future and the past of Roman history would work? Well, first of all, and as I said before, he will only be able to see the future and the past of Roman history since the foundation of Rome to the fall of Constantinople, nothing else. Therefore, he would not be able to know about the existence of the Americas since they were discovered by Europeans after the fall of Constantinople, to give an example. So sorry guys, no Eastern Romans with iPhones and TikToks. The man would not even be able to see things like the Industrial Revolution that happened almost 300 years ago already. Also, it would not be like some kind of foresight vision where the thing gets activated randomly when he doesn't choose to. No, you have to imagine that power as him having literally the Google search bar accessible in his brain, but only for looking to Roman civilization knowledge, nothing else. That's the closest thing I could compare it, with Justinian having literally access to the closest thing to the internet 1500 years earlier than all of us, which is crazy to think about. But even crazier than that, there is an expression familiar to modern historians, and perhaps you have heard it yourself before, which says that 90% of all Roman history, or antiquity, was lost forever in the shadows and echoes of all human history. And while the 90% number might be an exaggeration, it doesn't discredit the veracity of that expression. And while today, thanks to the internet, thousands, if not millions of people throughout the Western world and beyond, passionate and nostalgic for the glorious days of Rome and the heyday of our Western culture, continues to promulgate that glorious culture and dream that was once Rome, the reality is that, even with the gigantic sea of information that is the internet, we still know very little about the true history of that glorious civilization. But Justinian, in this alternate scenario, although with a much smaller range of information reach than we have today with the internet, he would literally be able to access that 90% of lost ancient knowledge. He would literally be more informed about the entire history of Rome in its entirety than we will ever be today. Just imagine how broken is that. And even more broken would be that Justinian could control all access to that knowledge without problems. For example, let's imagine that Justinian casually asks himself what Julius Caesar did with his day on May 9th, 90 BCE, when he was a little kid, to give a completely random and meaningless example. Well, instantly his power will activate, and Pam, he will know it. He will just know it. And keep in mind that this power works both to analyze and know events of the distant future or distant past multiple centuries apart from his own time, or simply predict what will happen in Roman lands in the next few seconds, being something literally more broken than having a spider sense to predict any danger or event about to occur. Every emperor, every battle, every betrayal, every plague, every reform, every failure, he would just know, only if he asked himself that, of course. Now, after having explained his amazing gift or power in this timeline, how it worked, and what will be his limitations with it, let's begin for real with this alternate story. When Justin and his young nephew finally arrived in Constantinople, nothing would be easy for them. At first, life in the imperial capital was far from ideal for them. They lived in poverty, sharing cramped quarters, scraping by on army stipends and odd favors. Justin, an illiterate peasant, now found himself in the unforgiving world of Eastern Roman politics and military life. He would have to build his legitimacy from the scratch, earning respect in the barracks, commanding discipline from soldiers, all while trying to feed and clothe his nephew and send money back to the family they left behind in Tauresium. But Justin, despite his humble origins, was also extremely intelligent and have great adaptability, and thanks to this, his raw discipline gradually earned him prestige in the Eastern Roman army. And little by little, rank by rank, he climbed the hierarchy of that society. Eventually, he rised in fortune, which meant that Justinian would receive a real education like Justin wished. And that would be the moment where the visions of the now new power of Justinian would truly start to manifest themselves. Because Justinian, or rather Flavius Petrus Sabatius, as he was still called back then, had never felt the same since the accident that had nearly killed him just before moving to Constantinople with his uncle. He tried to ignore it at first, brushing it off as lingering trauma, but eventually it became undeniable that there was something beyond only a broken mind due to head trauma. Every time he wondered something about Roman history, anything, he would suddenly just know it. At first, it was small things while studying Roman history with his tutors. Things about Julius Caesar maybe, the founder of Rome even, or maybe Augustus, Marcus Aurelius, Constantine. How did the lather decided that Byzantium would become the new capital of the Roman Empire? And so on. And every time he had a question about Roman civilization or history, boom, he would just know it instantly, with the information just downloaded into his mind, like Neo in Matrix learning Kung Fu. Thanks to Justin's rising wealth and patronage, Justinian gained access to better upper-class education in both Latin and Greek. He devoured books, and he walked the halls of Constantinople's great libraries, read scrolls, learned rhetoric, philosophy, and imperial law. And with every page he turned, his shock only would grow even more, because everything he read matched every time with what he already knew thanks to his visions, down to the smallest detail. That would be the moment, I think, where he will finally realize those were not hallucinations, they were real ancient Roman knowledge. The past of Rome lived within him now, and that terrified him. But Justinian, knowing how curious he was to learn about Roman history in our timeline, I have no doubt that here, even being terrified, he would be too tempted to know even more about the history of his ancestors taking advantage of that crazy power. And after having enjoyed during the days the enlightenment that was to learn all the factual and true knowledge of the history of the past, he would finally ask himself the next question: could he also see the future of Roman civilization? And after having asked that faithful question, he would see it all. The rise of his uncle Justin, his own coronation as emperor, the imperial court, the reconquest of Africa and Italy, the construction of the Hagia Sophia, the Nika riots, his future wife Theodora, the plague that would devastate his empire, many victories, glories, but also collapses, crisis, and resilience to survive. But then, he will go even further into the future. Aside of already being quite traumatized by knowing the exact day of his death, which would already be quite hard to handle for any man, he also saw the madness of his successor, Justin II. He saw the betrayal and murder of Maurice. He saw the monstrous rise of Phocas, the endless Sassanid wars, the fall of Jerusalem, the terrifying rise of Islam, the permanent loss of the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. And then it got worse the further he went into the future. He saw the rise of those barbarian Franks, with their king being called Roman. He saw schisms, heresies, crusades, the sack of Constantinople by the Latins, and of course, the Black Death. And finally, the unthinkable, he saw the fall of Constantinople and the true end of the Roman Empire once and for all at the hands of the Turks. Simply put, It was too much to handle for one man, so young and so full of energy, already drawn by the weight of his now gigantic amount of knowledge of the history of his civilization. Justinian, being only a young man, would collapse under the weight of this apocalyptic knowledge. And after that, for a while, he would withdraw himself, isolated and in silence. He wandered the streets with a distant gaze, tortured by futures no one else could see. Justin and others around him thought he had gone mad, struck permanently by the trauma of his accident on his head once Justin mentioned that event to others. But in truth, Justinian was just trying to process it all. And slowly he began to understand his power better. It wasn't just about seeing the distant past or the distant future. He could see everything, at least what he thought was everything, because remember, he's just able to see all the past and future of Roman civilization and the knowledge of every single Roman that had ever lived or will ever live in the future, nothing more. But he will soon realize with a better understanding and mastery of his power that he didn't need to go further into the future or the past, because even the near future, the next few seconds were to his reach, and if he focused enough, he could predict every word in a conversation, every step a person would take, every plot before it was whispered, literally, something better than spider sense or ultra instinct together, to give an example. And after many long years with this power, he eventually recovered from the shock of accessing to all that knowledge of history, and will finally feel more capable to handle the emotional, overwhelming shock to know so much about the future, but also the past, realizing finally, after a few years of getting used to that power, that it was not a curse, it was a gift, a divine gift maybe, that will give him the chance to stop everything bad before it happened. And so, with a mind sharper and more knowledgeable than any mind in history could be before the invention of the internet, armed with the collective memory of over 2,200 years of Roman history and a burning sense of duty to change the inevitable, Justinian will finally start to plan and take actions, not just in order to restore Rome's glory like he did in our timeline, but by becoming the savior of that civilization and ensuring that it will truly never fall no matter what, even after his death. Eventually, once Justinian gained enough confidence in the mastery of his extraordinary gift, he would make the decision to reveal it, but only to one person, his uncle. At first, Justin, a grizzled veteran, now a rising figure in Constantinople's elite, would probably just ignore it, dismissing his nephew's strange words as the eccentric delusions of a bright but overly imaginative boy in the best case, and at worst, the proof that he was really crazy as his closest friends told him all the time. But then, something would change. Every time Justinian opened his mouth, he would predict something, a sentence someone was about to say, a random passerby tripping on a stone, the exact dish they'd be served during a feast, and way more. Simply put, no matter how trivial or how impossibly specific something to predict would be, he would always get it right, every single time. And then came the stories from the past, details about Justin's youth, things he had never told anyone, things no one could possibly know, exposed effortlessly by a nephew who hadn't even been born when they happened personally. It was then, and only then, that Justin understood that wasn't madness, it wasn't coincidence, his nephew truly had been gifted with something divine, he would think. Justinian would explain it as best as he could to his uncle, that for some unknown reason, his power allowed him only to access the full history of Roman civilization, past and future, only from the mythical founding of Rome in 753 BCE to the tragic fall of Constantinople in 1453 CE, and nothing else after or before that. And for Justin, all of those revelations would be overwhelming, a dizzying torrent of knowledge from a future he could barely comprehend, but with his days numbered and age catching up to him, Justin would make a fateful decision. He would entrust his reign, and perhaps the future of Rome itself, to his nephew and his crazy divine gift. So, by 518 CE, when Justin officially became Eastern Roman Emperor, even if the world thought he was the main ruler of the empire, in truth, it was already Justinian who was deciding everything. Justin, now a respected frontman, would act as the executor of a far greater will, and with the enormous wealth left behind by the Emperor Anastasius still resting in the imperial treasury, Justinian could finally begin to reshape the empire from the shadows. He knew exactly what to do, because he had already seen what would come and he was going to stop it. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the great legal codex we associate with Justinian's reign, would be written years earlier, but this time it would be perfected from the start, using hindsight from centuries of future Roman legal failures, misinterpretations, and abuses. Justinian would preemptively patch loopholes, clarify ambiguous doctrines, and design a legal system far more robust than the one we know today, one capable of resisting the political fragmentation and corruption that would one day poison the empire from within and even beyond in the Western world as a whole. And the best way to spread those reforms and laws would be with a machine the world hadn't yet dreamed of, the printing press. And here's the thing, the Romans could build it. They already had metal casting, paper from Egypt and Chinese imports, ink production, and advanced gearing mechanisms, as evidenced by the Antikythera device centuries earlier. With Justinian's vision and the empire's engineering expertise, he would commission workshops to mass-produce movable type and rotary presses, effectively launching the information age 1,000 years ahead of schedule. Books, manuals, edicts, and laws would flood the provinces, literacy would rise, and average citizens would finally have consistent access to imperial texts to educate themselves. Also, knowing the unspeakable horrors of the Justinian plague that was about to arrive soon, Justinian would act fast. Books on basic hygiene and disease prevention would be printed and distributed empire-wide. He would enforce quarantine protocols, isolate infected ships before entering ports, mandate urban sanitation systems, and restore Roman aqueducts to their former glory. Soap production would also become a state priority. Vinegar and cloth masks would be used in hospitals, or at least places that would act like the medieval or early modern meaning of hospital. Medical schools would be founded. The foundations of germ theory wouldn't be discovered, of course, but they would be practiced indirectly without knowing, just like the early modern Europeans in our timeline. All of that in preparation for the invisible enemy that would soon arrive, which was the plague that would bear his name in the future. And also, yes, he would know about gunpowder, but its effective weaponization would take centuries. Instead, Justinian would perfect the empire's greatest existing superweapon in the near future after its time, the Greek fire, standardizing its production, training naval units in its use, and deploying it not just for sieges but also as a psychological weapon. He would turn it into a symbol of Roman divine wrath. At the same time, he would print manuals compiling the greatest Roman military strategies from people like Scipio Africanus, Caesar, Traianus, his future personal general Belisarius, and beyond, creating the definitive military doctrines of Roman warfare for generations to come. Also, knowing the Great Famine of 536 was imminent, Justinian would prepare everything in advance, introducing the three-field crop rotation method, promoting use of heavy plows suited for northern soils, building windmills and watermills to automate grain processing, establishing emergency granaries and improve storage logistics, replanting deforested zones to stabilize microclimates, coordinating pan-imperial agricultural reform through printed instruction in local academies. The famine would still be terrible, sure, but way more survivable, which would already be very positive considering all the calamities that the empire was about to experience in the following decades. With all these changes, Justinian would start the Renaissance almost a millennium ahead of schedule. State patronage would flood into sculpture, architecture, painting, and theater, reviving the classical styles of the Princeps era. With realistic statues reappearing in public forums, libraries would be restored, and academies founded. The philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius would once again be debated in imperial schools, and engineers like Heron of Alexandria would be studied, emulated, and eventually surpassed, but that would be for later to explain. A truly cultural rebirth only 5 decades after the fall of Western Rome. And above all of that, also other important stuff to rediscover would be Roman concrete mass production, a knowledge lost after the 3rd century. Roads and bridges would be maintained and extended, new lighthouses and harbors would be built across strategic coastal cities, a postal relay system, modeled after the Mongol yam, but centuries earlier, which, combined with the printing press, would be a huge improvement to give access to information quicker through the empire, which would be a huge deal and game changer for Roman administration and would allow rapid communication. Also, state-sponsored banks and loan systems would stabilize the economy, with the solidus being reaffirmed as a gold standard, curbing inflation and empowering trade, all of it driven by Justinian's knowledge of future economic crises. The empire and its people would praise Justin, the aging emperor, for his wisdom and reforms, with no one suspecting that the true architect of the empire's golden resurgence was his quiet, calculating, prodigiously gifted nephew, armed with the complete knowledge of over 2,200 years of Roman civilization, leaving all the necessary foundations for a better and more glorious Roman reconquest than in our timeline. And this time, Justinian would be ready. Eventually, with Justin's health visibly declining and the days of his life nearly counted, Justinian would finally receive his first official mission to take care of personally, one that would take him into the realm of real power. He would be tasked with managing the Iberian Wars against the Sassanids, a campaign that would become the proving ground for the young heir's genius, and the moment where he would meet for the very first time a young man by the name of Belisarius, the man who would become his right hand in the goals he has in life. Now, in our timeline, Justinian was no soldier or general material, he never led armies nor was trained in the arts of war, but this version of Justinian had been preparing for years, absorbing centuries of military history, studying every single strategy, learning from every battle through all of Roman history, past, present, and future. He was no longer just a legal scholar or administrator, he was, in every meaningful sense, a master strategist. But truth be told, even that wasn't the real advantage, because no matter how sharp his mind had become, Justinian's true edge lay in something far more broken, his power. The power to see, to predict, whether it was the distant future or the next 5 seconds. He could know every shift in the battlefield, know exactly when and where an ambush would strike, how many men would come, what their formations would look like, what tactic they would use, what weakness they'd try to exploit, and simply counter it in advance with surgical precision. Veteran generals would of course grumble in protest, baffled and even insulted to see a city boy placed above them, but their doubts would be silenced when every plan of Justinian turned out to be perfect, down to the smallest of variables, time after time, without fail. And so, under his unassuming but absolute command, the Eastern Roman forces would march into Persia with near supernatural efficiency. The Iberian War, which in our timeline dragged on for 6 long years, would be over in less than 1, with the result being total and utter humiliation for the Sassanids. Eastern Roman casualties would be negligible, while the Persian armies would be crushed, routed, and demoralized, unable to understand how the hell every single of their moves had been anticipated. Armenia would return to the Roman sphere, along with several key territories in northern Mesopotamia, and then, in a lightning strike no one expected, Justinian would do the unthinkable. He would invade the outskirts of the Persian capital itself. Ctesiphon, the heart of the Sasanian Empire, would burn completely, with Greek fire used everywhere, siege towers and artillery based on both classical Roman and future medieval designs would reduce fortifications in days, even less sometimes, and in the chaos, primitive explosives based on early gunpowder weapons would be deployed, a horrifying taste of what the future would one day hold thanks to Justinian's power. The message would be simple and brutal: the Sassanids had to stay down. This single campaign would destabilize the Sassanids for a generation, ensuring no serious threat from the east that would interrupt Justinian's next objectives in the near future. By the time he returned to Constantinople, he was a hero, a victor, a living legend, and he returned just in time to be by his uncle's side as the old emperor, now at peace, passed away, knowing that Rome's future was in the safest hands imaginable. And so, in 527 CE, Justinian ascended to the throne as sole emperor in triumph. And with that, the second part of his plans would begin. First, Justinian would do everything in his knowledge and power to prevent the Nika riots. In our timeline, the Nika riots nearly cost him his throne, but here things would be different. With his uncle's widely admired legacy of reforms, and with Justinian's own military victories and revolutionary ideas, the emperor would command real legitimacy from the beginning. There would be no whispers of corruption or tyranny, no popular unrest. The people would be with him, and that would make all the difference. By 528 CE, just 1 year into his reign, he would be ready to launch the most ambitious project of all, the Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the plan of the restoration of the Roman Empire. With the eastern provinces richer, healthier, and more technologically advanced than ever before, and with the printing press and new postal networks ensuring rapid communication across the realm, Justinian could now afford something no Roman emperor had done in a very long time. He would travel with his armies personally, with of course his first target being the Vandals in North Africa. Together with Belisarius and a newly modernized imperial fleet, incorporating future naval designs inspired by Portuguese and Spanish shipbuilding centuries ahead of schedule, Justinian would cross the sea. Greek fire would again serve as his main weapon, devastating the Vandals that had ruled Carthage and Mauritania since the fall of the West. Victory would be total and absolute, with most of North Africa coming back into direct Roman control, while the other smaller and lesser Berber territories would be turned into client states of the empire. And then, his next step would be to invade Hispania and Italy. By 529 CE, his fleets would launch coordinated coastal invasions of Visigothic Hispania and Ostrogothic Italy, armed with superior logistics, battlefield foresight, and relentless morale. Justinian's army would destroy the disunited barbarian kingdoms in rapid succession. On land, a second Roman force would simultaneously move through Illyria, crushing resistance as it advanced westward. By 532 CE, just 4 years into his reign, Justinian would already have reconquered the same territories it took him nearly 4 decades to regain in our timeline, and even a bit more. He would be acclaimed as the Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, as a statement of fact. But of course, Justinian wouldn't stop there. Immediately after, reconstruction efforts would begin, cities would be rebuilt, roads repaved, hospitals founded, printing presses installed in every major town, laws distributed, agricultural systems modernized, aqueducts restored, engineers trained, roads extended, and trade protected. The newly reborn Roman provinces would not just return to the fold, they would be restored and glorified, cleaner, wealthier, and more advanced and urbanized than ever before. And yet, despite all the glory and all the victories, the worst was still to come. Because Justinian knew that the clock was ticking, and the plague that would bear his name, the deadliest disease the Roman world would ever know until that point, was already on its way, and this time he would definitely be ready for it. After those massive victories that elevated Justinian's prestige to heights no Roman emperor had ever reached before, the next step would be obvious: consolidate everything. His newly reconquered provinces of Italy, Illyria, North Africa, and Eastern Hispania would need to be integrated, restructured, and brought into the modernized world he had already spent years constructing in the East, with infrastructure, education, law, sanitation, agriculture, postal relays, the printing press, all the mechanisms of progress and stability being implemented as quickly as possible, but more than anything else, preparing for the main threat he was expecting for all of his empire, the sadly known Justinian plague, which, comedically enough, I'm pretty sure Justinian would ensure that the plague would not be remembered with his name in this alternate timeline. But anyway, the plague was coming, and Justinian knew it. He would have seen it in all its horror, in records and visions alike. He would have studied the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Cyprian, and worst of all, the Black Death that would come 800 years after his own time. He understood how it spread, what patterns it followed, and how completely unprepared the ancient world was for such a force of nature. And so, from the moment he returned from war, he threw everything he had into preparation. Hospitals, true hospitals, would be constructed in every major city. Medical manuals, sanitation guides, and quarantine protocols would be printed and distributed across the empire. Urban water systems would be restored, waste management enforced, and food supply chains secured. Soap production would be practically industrialized. Vinegar fumigation, cloth masks, and disinfectants would become state policy. Medical schools would train new generations of practitioners not just in theory, but in crisis protocols designed to slow the spread of death. And even with all of that, even with 2 millennia of historical hindsight, Justinian knew that many lives would still be lost. Because let's be real here, guys, this was still a world without germ theory, a world where antibiotics, microscopes, and virology didn't exist, a world where, even with everything he could offer, he was still just a man fighting a force of nature as a plague like that one was. And yet, thanks to his efforts, the results would be drastically better than what happened in our own timeline. Instead of wiping out 20 to 30% of the Roman population, the plague would kill at most 10%. Still horrific, still a tragedy, yes, but still more manageable. Because unlike in our timeline, the empire here was strong, unified, logistically superior, and led by a ruler who knew exactly what was coming. This period of plague would also become a period of reflection, a time of writing, of archiving, and of teaching. Justinian would begin pouring his knowledge of the future into texts and manuscripts, not just about law and engineering, but about history, ethics, strategy, and human nature. These works would quickly be hailed by scholars as the most revolutionary text in Roman intellectual history, containing insights that no man should have been able to possess. And eventually, to a very small circle of his most trusted allies, he would begin to reveal the truth that he had been chosen, that he had been gifted, that his visions of the future were divine. Not everyone would believe him at first, but the evidence would be impossible to deny. Belisarius, Theodora, a handful of his closest generals and scholars, these few would become the inner circle of what might one day be called a sacred order, tasked with preserving the secrets of Rome's future. They would write what he dictated, they would record every coming danger, the rise of Islam, the collapse of Persia, the invasions of the Turks, the Mongol invasion, the Crusades, the fall of Constantinople, and far more. These records would not be printed for the public, but stored in sealed vaults, treated as sacred scrolls, only to be read by the wisest, most loyal, and the most faithful of humans. The formula of Greek fire had once been the most guarded secret of the empire in our timeline, but here it would be joined by the fate of the world itself, which would become the most guarded knowledge in all the world. And then, once the worst of the plague had passed, Justinian would move again, because he knew his time was limited, he knew exactly how many years he had left to live, and he would not waste a second of it. With the east secure and the central Mediterranean fully restored, he would turn westward once more. First, to finish off the remains of the Visigoths in western Hispania, mopping up the last of their resistance in brutal precision. Then he would go to Gaul. The Franks, in this timeline, were not yet the towering empire builders of Charlemagne's day, but Justinian knew what they would become. He had seen the rise of France, he had seen the Norman invasions, the 100 Years' War, and far more, and so, with full awareness of their future potential, he would crush them utterly. Every dynasty, every tribal remnant, and every seed of future rebellion. The territories of Gaul would be brought back into Roman hands, their administration modernized, their lands redistributed to loyal veterans, and their cities integrated into the imperial network of roads, printing centers, and academies. And then, inevitably, there was Britain, a backwater in every sense of the word, poor, divided, primitive, and frankly irrelevant. But Justinian knew what would come from there: the rise of the Angles and Saxons, the long shadow of England, the birth of a kingdom that would one day have a huge impact in Europe, and he couldn't allow that knowing all of what he knew. So even if Britain had to be reconquered, he wouldn't need to go himself. His presence wasn't required for such a minor theater of war, but his legions, trained by his reforms, emboldened by victory, and strengthened by new technologies, would sail north and conquer the island with ease, and Roman banners would fly once more in that province. By 555 CE, the task would be complete. Rome was whole again. From the highlands of Caledonia to the deserts of Syria, from the rich valleys of Gaul to the palaces of Constantinople, the Roman Empire was reborn, stronger, wiser, healthier, more literate, more connected, and more prepared. But even after all of that, Justinian still wasn't finished, not yet. Now that the Roman Empire has been returned to its former glory, instead of continuing to recount the possible future expansions of that reunited and revived Roman Empire, I want to focus in this last part of the video on an aspect that I have been evading all this time on purpose: religion, more specifically, the future of Christianity as a result of all the changes that Justinian will have brought about in this history with his powers. Because after a lifetime of exploring the memories and knowledge of Rome's pagan era, I have no doubt that Justinian would have had a very changed perspective on Christianity and its legitimacy as a religion, given the enormous hindsight that he has. However, I do not think that Justinian would renounce Christianity and return to paganism due to the extremely useful political tool and weapon that Christianity was. Justinian would have had an absolutely objective perspective on every opinion and side of every person's story throughout Rome's long history. He would have seen in his visions that the pagans were not the barbaric and oppressive monsters that religious figures described them as, and that they were indeed capable of demonstrating kindness and piety. In fact, many of the values that pagan Romans held were very similar and close to the values of virtue promoted by Christianity, making that religion inspired by or copied from the pagans anyway. But he also saw the powerful, unifying, and manipulative power that Christianity can have, very useful in keeping the population controlled and loyal to the leaders of their civilization. In the end, it wouldn't matter what Justinian personally thought or believed, whether he felt more pagan or Christian. As the pragmatic man that he was, he knew how to leverage both perspectives for his purposes, having the great advantage of an absolute open-mindedness that wouldn't limit his decisions, literally giving him an objective perspective on everything he analyzed thanks to his powers. I believe Justinian would maintain the ideal goal he had in our timeline: one empire, one religion. However, here he would apply that goal with more nuances, revisiting ancient pagan ideas and applying them to a contemporary Christian context. What I'm trying to get at is that Justinian would do everything he could to crush and stop any independent institutionalization from the imperial power of Christianity, as Roman Catholicism was going to be one day, as he saw how terrible and corrupt that institution of Christianity could be, what terrible popes there could be to represent the religion, and how that would lead to the terrible religious divisions between West and East, leading all the way to the eventual fateful day of the Fourth Crusade, from which his empire would never recover. Understanding the corruption that the institutionalization of Christianity and its different variants could create in the future, and in turn, the chaos and division among the entire Christian population, which ironically would destroy the original purpose of peacefully unifying the people within the supposed love that God gave to his followers, Justinian would decide to revolutionize the very conception of religion and Christianity for that time. One of the main reasons why Justinian, with his foresight, decided that one of the most urgent things he had to do was to democratize and normalize the use of the printing press throughout his empire was so that the Bible would be massively printed everywhere, creating new generations of literary people who could read the Bible with their own eyes and perspectives, and not simply listen to the words of a monk or priest, of whom you would only have to trust that he was not telling you nonsense in order to know about the sacred text beforehand. Thanks to that, new generations of Christians could have a deeper and more personal understanding of religion and how to conceive their own faith, which would dismantle any usefulness of having representative institutions of Christianity. After all, what was the point of having a leader representing the religion who could dictate all the ways he wanted to apply that religion in people's lives, if those same people already had access to the sacred scriptures that explained everything that had to be done in order to be a good Christian? Why should I listen to a man to dictate my understanding of my faith when the words of God will always be above the words of any representative of that same faith? These would be the questions that the new generations of literary Romans would ask themselves, allowing Justinian the legitimacy and freedom to completely dismantle and put an end to any representative power of Christianity, such as what would become the Catholic Pope of Rome in the future. And this is where the ideas of the past would serve Justinian well. Despite not reintroducing or reofficializing pagan religions, he would allow classical philosophical debate to coexist with theological debates, leading to greater understanding and acceptance of different understandings of the same faith, and also re-implementing the policy of tolerance between different faiths. And therefore, such a policy of tolerance would allow and accept the coexistence of Chalcedonian Christianity, Nestorianism, Miaphysitism, Donatism, and much more, under the condition that everyone accepted and understood that they were all part of something else, of general Christianity, and that it was the duty of every citizen always to investigate and go deeper into the sacred scriptures in order to get as close as possible to the ideal of the eventual true Christianity that everyone hoped to find among the sometimes tense, but always peaceful and rational debates. And that's where Justinian's genius plan would bear its fruit. In this alternate timeline, with the tremendous success of the reigns of Justin and Justinian, it would be very easy after many decades of a demonstration of extreme and high predictive capacity to consider the Justinian dynasty as a dynasty of prophets sent directly to earth by the hand of God himself, being there to guide them as the absolute ruler of the Roman Empire, destined to bring Christianity to its universal glory. And thanks to this propaganda, Justinian could justify that the Roman emperors were the ones who represented the supreme and absolute authority of the Christian religion throughout the world, with all variants of Christianity being under the protection and tolerance of the same emperor with prophetic powers. Prophetic powers that his successors would be able to imitate or partially replicate to maintain the illusion, thanks to all the sacred texts that Justinian would leave behind, so that a very closed circle of people would know about all the events of the future and what was about to happen, in addition to the gigantic knowledge of Roman history in its most minute and absolute detail as Justinian was able to represent in writing. Thanks to all of these reforms, emperors have a greater level of guarantee of being worthy and competent rulers by not handing over the sacred knowledge of the future to just anyone random, and the tolerance of different variants of Christianity would ironically create greater unity around that religion. While, as in the Renaissance of our reality, paganism would progressively return in its aesthetics, art, and methodology, but people would still be Christians, considering the paganism of the old gods as a cultural, artistic, and historical curiosity, rather than a religious one, being able to have the best of both worlds without creating any tension or crisis due to corrupt religious institutions that could provoke conflicts and wars for centuries to come. And with that, and with Justinian having left all the necessary instructions and knowledge to his empire so that it would become the most advanced civilization in the world, with centuries ahead of the rest that would surely cause an industrial revolution much sooner than expected, the visionary emperor could finally rest in peace, knowing perfectly well what day his death would be, a fact that he had already fully accepted years ago, being fully satisfied with the work he did during his long life with that power and divine gift he received, and on his deathbed, Justinian would again look into the farthest future he could go, but observing the version of the world with the consequences of all the changes that he caused in this timeline, and simply put, the world he saw in the year 1453 of that alternate reality was so glorious and beautiful that the dying emperor could not help but shed a tear of happiness on his deathbed, having thus ensured that Rome would be truly eternal. And with that, I think this is the perfect moment to end this video. I hope all of you enjoyed it. Thank you to all of you for having watched this video until the end. I think this is the longest video I've done so far. And by the way, for those of you who wanted to see a part 2 of my Eastern Rome Immune to the Black Deaths video, stay tuned because the sequel is coming next to this video. Also, the Asterix and Obelix Existings video had reached and surpassed by a lot the goal of 1,000 likes to continuing it, so eventually, that alternate scenario will also have a sequel. Thank you very much all of you for the great support you give. I'm very proud and thankful for the community we're building here in such a short amount of time since I started, and I can guarantee you, this is just the beginning. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.